The Wisconsin Realtors Association is pleased to present this virtual conference session entitled Seeing Double, Making the Most of a Multiple Offer Market. We are very pleased to welcome all of you to this session. And now, it is my pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Pam Skaleski. Pam, welcome to the program.
Thank you. And hello, everyone, from Stevens Point, snowy Stevens Point. I am the broker at Prism Real Estate, and I'm also a WRA Real Estate School trustee. One responsibility of the Real Estate School is to provide interesting and informative educational programs to help you in your business. Today's session is full of valuable information guaranteed to help your business, so I hope you can take advantage of it and the knowledge our speaker has to offer. Feel free to ask questions at any time in the chat box, and I'll do my best to work with our speaker to answer them during our time together. If we are unable to answer the questions, we will respond after the program. So without further delay, let's get started. It's my pleasure to introduce you Pam Ehrman. And Pam Ehrman has spent her entire business career in real estate, obtaining her license at the age of 18, entering full-time management career by the age of 24. She has spent 25 years coaching individual agents, teams, and companies to their highest levels of productivity. Pam has accomplished highly successful management careers in both a privately owned and franchise branded business model, and has authored 2 successful training series specific to business planning and to dynamic growth of real estate. Being selected as a Real Estate Educator of the Year in her home state of Virginia is just one of her career milestones. In addition to instructing for numerous state GRI programs and joining the cadre of national CRS specialist programs, we are pleased to welcome Pam Ehrman. Pam, welcome to the virtual conference.
Thank you, Pam. Well, this should be easy. We're not going to mess up a name, are we?
Nope.
So anyway, guys, I'm real excited about this. I really do think it's one of the real privileges of my career is to be able to get to the point that I have the ability to interact with realtors around the United States. And so thank you for having me today. I am going to be speaking about multiple offer market strategies. And I think what we find is when we're dealing with them, half the time we're dealing with how they affect the seller, and half the time we're dealing with how they affect the buyer, right? It depends on who our client is. And so we're going to come from those 2 different perspectives today. Oh, actually, I do not have the arrows, forgive me, for advancing the slides. If you all can help me with that one, I just need to move them forward at this point because we're going to be talking about the seller perspective first. Looking at the seller perspective, and we'll go to the next slide, one of the things that are most important is talking about this whole concept of tracking supply and demand. Supply and demand is the foundation of a multiple offer market. You can't have really a multiple offer market going on unless you have the principles of supply and demand readily at work. And you can advance for me. Supply and demand is really about looking at a buyer's market and a seller's market, knowing that most multiple offer markets are going to come where there's a minimum of inventory. And so when we take a really close and quick look, a simple look at what a supply and demand market looks like with multiple offers, go back one cent if you can for me. A seller's market is going to be where there's low listing inventory and there's high demand, right? Low supply, high demand. A buyer's market is going to be where there's high supply and low demand at this point. So we know that the seller's market is what we're talking about when we get into multiple offer markets. Next one. 2 factors that we're looking at. Next slide. Specific factors are total number of listed properties that are listed during a particular period of time compared to the total number of closed properties. And I'm sharing something with you that I have been tracking now for probably 7-8 years. It's amazing that these 2 simple things, if you track them, will tell you whether you're coming into a multiple offer market. It'll tell you whether certain sections of your city are in a multiple offer market. It can tell you whether you're coming out of it if you're watching your absorption, what I call absorption ratios. And we do it by doing just these 2 specific factors. total number of listings taken over a specific period of time. In this case, I used one full year from January 1 to 12/31 of 2018, and then comparing the exact same time for the number of closed properties that occurred in that same time frame. I have not found an MLS system that I cannot pull this information from, or where I've taught it in an area and they couldn't get the information. So go to the next slide. Absorption ratios, I want to make sure that what we're really talking about here is we're not talking about absorption rates. I understand I have a form for tracking absorption rates. We use it in pricing. What I'm talking about is the ratio of closed sales divided by closed listings. And when we take that over a period of time, it gives me a ratio. So go to the next page and let's take a look at that. The interesting thing for me, out of all the places I ever taught, the one place that actually does this as a norm is Canada. I was up talking to the Winnipeg Realtors, and they were in a pretty major multiple offer market, and they actually did this ratio of new listings to sales. And they found that at a very specific point, the market would start to experience multiple offers. So I'm going to show you this in a little bit more of a spreadsheet. So let's go to the next, and let me give you an idea of how I've calculated this. This next slide I'm showing you is actually our market. I'm from Virginia Beach, Virginia. We call it Hampton Roads. It's a conglomeration of about 4 different markets. And you can see back in 2008 that we had about 8,000 sales at that time with 21,000 listings. And if you'll click again, you're going to see that the ratio for that, go ahead and click, is 37%. Well, obviously a 37% ratio, when you look at this, is not going to be a ratio that, look here on 2008 on this slide, you can see how far down we are in that process, whereas, click again please, just one time. When you look at this, the seller's market tends to occur when that ratio is 50% or higher. And it starts to definitely be a multiple offer market when we see 60% or more, which is what you're going to see over and over again, even in your market. I'll bet you if you track it, that once you hit 60% or more, you will have pockets of the market that is experiencing the multiple offer syndrome, so to speak. And when you get to a higher level of 60%, you'll start to see more and more of the market. At one time, you can see in my market, back in 2003 and 2004, look at how high it was. Those points were between 80 and 90% of our market was the absorption ratio was selling at that point. We had multiple offers happening on almost every home in our marketplace way back then. All right, so click again. So in looking at this, keep going if you will. You can see below that the buyer's market tends to be, when you fall below that 50 to 60% tends to be where we're transitioning from one market to the other. Click again, please. And when we go on, there we go. I'm going to start moving this up from 2008 to recovery. You can see in recovery in 2012, by the end of December, we were starting to hit approximately 59% by the end of the year. 15,000 sales occurred, 25,000 listings occurred, and that relationship between those two numbers had us at about 60%. Well, if you all remember, click again please, 2013 was a really substantial year for most areas of the country. It was a great recovery year. And look what happened. By the end of that year, we were sitting at about 60%. Multiple offers were occurring in our market. They surely weren't occurring at 30 and 40% ratios. We were in the slide at 30 and 40% ratios. Click again, please. And we go from there into 2016, moving all the way forward to 2016. And 2016, again, we had 14 and 15 in between. It kind of was a little bit of a lull. People were wondering whether the market was changing a little bit, but it was really just kind of settling in. And by 2016, it started to outperform 2013. Look at where we were by the end of that year. Rolling into 2017, we were getting a strength going, but we were seeing some listings starting to increase. That ratio of listings, you know, we talk about in a seller's market, listings are reducing, sales are going up. Well, you can see here we were starting to go the other way. Listings were starting to come on the market, but sales were still outperforming. Next slide, please. on 2017, by the end of 2017, next slide if you will, there you go. We were sitting by the end of 2017 still in a very positive market. 62% our market has been experiencing multiple offers. These figures continue to ring true. And last one please if you will. In 2018, by the time we got to the end of 2018, this was some of the last ones that I was tracking at that time, and we were finishing up the year strong. So going in and really tracking this kind of stuff, go to the last one, which was December. You're going to find that by the end of December, click one more time, please. By the end of December, we were rolling into this year that I'm in right now with a lot of our market experiencing 65% ratios, which tells me very clearly I'm getting ready to roll into a pretty darn strong first quarter. Now, a first quarter in most markets is usually the weakest of the four to a certain extent, depending on weather and depending on people coming off of holidays and all kinds of other stuff. But I can tell you it was one of the strongest first quarters we've ever had, and our market told us that. Excuse me. All right, next slide, please. Let's talk about some additional marketing strategies. We've talked about those market strategies and understanding that. Let's talk about some market strategies, because here's what happens from the seller standpoint. We tend to look at it and go, gosh, we're getting multiple offers anyway. I don't really need to do a whole lot more to the house, but this is what I do know. If you will spend a little bit more time in a market where you know you're dealing with multiple offers and you'll start to really put some marketing strategies behind it, man, you can start really driving value for that seller. And you may not want to push the price but so far because you don't want to overprice it and have to worry about appraisals and things along that line unless somebody's going to guarantee the appraisal. But you may be able to get people that there's such demand for it because now we're talking about price, terms, and conditions. We're talking about being priced right and parade ready. At that point, you may have people starting to back off of no closing cost, right? Or giving the seller all kinds of terms, or maybe a home inspection that maybe they want to do, but they're not going to ask for any repairs because they want the house. And those are all things that we know come with. We don't all feel comfortable with that, but they come with multiple offers. Go to the next one, please, if you will. First strategy that I'm going to share with you, and I shared it with our first class as well, is what I call the open house marketing strategy. And this is a marketing strategy that I introduce to the seller in a multiple offer market. When I know they're in the driver's seat, I will intentionally, and I'm going to ask you to start clicking on this one. Click through the next one. So when we look at this, we're talking about 2 weekends. First weekend is to maximize buyer exposure. The second weekend, click again, is going to be to maximize their negotiating position, because we all know that in a multiple offer market, it will often sell within your first week. And so some of what we do is we try to list the property on a Thursday and Friday so that we make sure that we're not violating our MLS regulations. That allows us to usually turn it in by like Friday evening, which allows us to roll into the weekend without a contract fully negotiated at that point. We hold it open, we maximize buyer exposure, and we tell the seller we are after pinned up demand. We're looking for people that are working off of Zillow, and they're looking at their apps, and it's telling them clearly, hey, by the way, that area that you marked, there's a new listing, and they're holding it open today. We're looking for people that are out there driving around so we can maximize the buyer exposure, control as much of it as we can, and then know that we say to the seller we want a commitment right up front for a second open house, because Mr. and Mrs. Seller, if we sell it by Wednesday, I want there to be another open house on the books, so when someone comes through that following weekend, I can say, let me give you a heads up, we already had this scheduled. However, at this point, we didn't want to cancel the open house. It was already on the books. If anything happens, we have an a home inspection coming up in the next week. If something happens, would you want to know about it? Absolutely. And guess what they do? They start handing you their name and their phone number. There's no sales at that point. They are now in a fear of loss scenario. Gosh, this house, we loved it. We want to know. Here's our name and phone number and contact information. So it allows you to maximize your marketing strategies. Go to the next slide, please. The other thing that we do is if we're listing on Thursday and Friday, then we're ad boosting for Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. And this is an example of an ad boost. It shows you the kind of numbers we're getting off of a house in a multiple offer market. 7,000 people reached, 1,600 people clicking through. And we also tell the seller, because here's our other challenge. Sometimes in a multiple offer market, can sellers overprice their listing? Can somebody give me an amen in the chat box? Is it true that in a in a multiple offer market, that sometimes you deal with the seller trying to overprice the listing because they've seen so much activity? Okay? So if that's the case, this is the way that we're able to control their expectations. Mr. and Mrs. Seller, after this weekend, if we've had 1,600 people online looking at your house, if we've had 7,000 eyeballs on the listing, if we've had 2 open houses and people pouring in, if we don't have a contract within that time frame, we're not waiting for 30 days for a listing reduction. We're looking at 12 to 14 days for our first listing price reduction. And I can tell you I've done it over and over, and it works. It's legitimate. All right? So the next thing is, again, being aware of how staging and photography matters in regards to driving top dollar, right? And so let's just look at, in this case, here's some pictures of a house that was listed with a different company prior to us taking it over. These are legitimate, real pictures, and this house sat on the market for almost 5 months. I mean, that one looks like the paranormal room, right? We took it at that point, and we guaranteed her top dollar photography. This is the exact same house. This is about $1,500 put into some upgrades within the home. You can see that we spent a little bit of money on Craigslist and matched up the appliances with used appliances. Look at the difference in this house. Even the paranormal room looks normal. And when we put it back on the market, we had an offer in less than 2 weeks to a sight unseen buyer who came from out of town, saw it online, and asked their buyers asked their agent to write a contract on their behalf as a sight unseen buyer and purchase the home. All right? So we've talked about maximizing from a seller's perspective. Let's talk about the buyer's perspective. We all know what it feels like when you're dealing with that buyer in a market, right, where they're dealing with multiple offers. Are they in, after, 1 or 2 houses, are they in a very good mood? It's like, what am I going to have to do? Sell my firstborn at this point. And they start to get some frustration within the marketplace. I love this. I thought this was so cute. Sometimes we get that buyer that's just unrealistic. If the seller will replace the roof, add a deck, put in a fireplace, et cetera, move it to the other side of town, we're definitely interested. Well, a multiple offer market is not that kind of buyer. And we get this person that if we have counseled them properly at the buyer counseling session, and we have introduced them to the concept of the multiple offer market, we can avoid this feeling where they look at us somewhere in the process and go, who do you represent? I mean, I thought you were working for me. Well, what they have to understand is that our responsibilities become winning the house for them, not getting them the lowest possible price on the home, because we know clearly in order to compete in a multiple offer market, it's usually not going to happen by offering the lowest price. Okay? Negotiations tend to be about putting you in first position, not winning over the seller. So we have to have that conversation. We have to talk about those things. And we all have the control freak mentality when it comes to the buyer. They want to control everything. And again, in your counseling session, there has to be that conversation about what it is we're really trying to accomplish. It's not about controlling. It's about competing in that scenario. My job is to put you in the best position to compete. The chances of us controlling the outcome become much more limited when we're talking about a multiple offer market. So dialogues, here's the dilemma dialogue, right? That when you get that buyer that just sometimes refuses, I can tell you what you want to hear and risk letting you down later, especially after we've lost 1, 2, 3 of the houses that you could have loved. Maybe your dream home and you're wondering why we didn't get it. Or I can tell you what you need to hear and risk losing your business. But I'd rather do that than consistently disappoint you because I didn't have the willingness to tell you what you needed to hear, to help you understand the market that you're in. Okay? So let's talk about the normal, these are the normal multiple offer strategies that occur. Excuse me. They're usually one of three scenarios. The first one is highest and best. And again, keep in mind that these are strategies that have been collected from around the country. We use them in our market. I've heard them used in many other markets. But please understand that there may be very specific nuances in your market that would eliminate this, would deregulate it. There might be ways and things that are not allowed. So just be aware of that. This is a discussion, and I wouldn't want you using anything that we talk about today without making sure you align it with your company, your broker, your MLS, your association, whatever it happens to be. But these are usually the three main strategies, highest and best, where that agent calls basically and says that you have the ability by a certain period of time, right? Highest and best is usually there's multiple offers received, and they notify all parties to basically put their best foot forward. There's no indication usually of what the offer or the seller will accept. It's like, hey, I've got 3 other offers. You've got till 5 o'clock tomorrow. Take your offer, do whatever you want to do with it, and send it back to me. Just know you've got like 2 other people you're competing with. And there's rarely a written counteroffer. They're rarely sending something back to the people. They're just putting them on notice, and they use the terms, we're looking for highest and best. Okay? They usually give a deadline. Need it by 5 o'clock tomorrow. We're going to be looking at all offers by 5 o'clock tomorrow. That tends to be the highest and best strategy. There's the second strategy, which is the multiple offer response. And in a multiple offer response, we actually have a form within our MLS system that allows us to plug in the multiple offers that will say, we're currently looking at 3 competitive offers. And here's the things on your particular offer that you really need to look at. You need to change your price. You need to reduce your closing costs. Whatever we think, you can be as general or specific as you choose to. Somebody could come back and say, increase price by $5,000, reduce closing costs by $4,000. They can say whatever they want to on this one and counter it back. And here again, this is the dialogue that usually occurs, or the language that usually occurs. This counteroffer, which is the multiple offer response addendum, will not be considered binding on the seller and buyer until it is signed by the buyers and then countersigned by the sellers. So they send the document, they ask the buyer to make arrangements based on what they just told them, and when the offer comes back with those changes, all parties then sign. And the reason for this is because you have a seller going out to 3 different people and saying, for you, I need you to do A, B, and C. For you, I need you to do D, E, and F. And for you, G, H, and I. It can be totally different because all 3 of the offers could have been totally different. One of them could say, you need to remove the contingency on the sale of your home. And the other 2 could be, an offer that came in that had nothing to do with the sale of a piece of property. But they're saying to the third one, you either remove that or, you can kind of call it quits at this point. And then when they get them back, what they want to make sure of is that you don't have offers 1 and 2 that meet the criteria you said, and you sold it twice. Without signatures, it's not possible to do that. It comes back, the buyers sign, and then the seller looks at the counters that come from the multiple offer response and decide which one they want. Now, in most cases, a lot of the places around the country have a very specific escalation agenda. I find all kinds of differences. Now, keep in mind, one of the reasons why I really, truly am qualified to teach this is I work for our Sales Managers Advisory Committee in our area. I helped to write the escalation addendums. It was my job to present it to the Board of Directors and go through all the points of why there was one that was needed to be able to streamline the negotiation points, because we had a lot of agents that were negotiating and not addressing things that left either party at risk without them understanding the risks that came up. So what I want to do with you today is just talk about, now again, please keep in mind, you can have all kinds of different addendums. You may have one that you can pull right now from your MLS, from your association. that you would be using, but here are some of the points that most of them address, things that can get somebody in trouble or change the direction of negotiations if they are or are not dealt with. Usually, there's a term that defines any other multiple offer. I call these the rules of engagement. So it starts to say, what are the terms that would define the other multiple offers? In this case, it says the competing offer is not contingent upon the sale of any other property belonging to any other prospective purchaser. It could be all kinds of different things that somebody says, if you're going to compare me to other offers, then it's not fair for you to compare me to somebody that sends you an offer, but it's a rent to own and they're not going to close for 2 years. Don't use that price against me. I want you to use I want you to use contracts that are decently similar in terms to compare. So how are you defining the other multiple offers? And next, we're going to talk about, and see, I put something on top of this. I gave you one, here's another one. Competing offers. A bona fide competing offer shall be one, submitted on appropriate MLS documents or association documents. For example, don't compare me to something that somebody wrote out for you on a napkin when they had lunch with you yesterday. That's not what I define as a competing offer, right? So defining very specific, a closing date not to exceed. It could be 6 months from the date. That it wouldn't be contingent on the sale of a buyer's property because mine's not. But keep in mind that each one that you add, if you're the buyer, a seller can look at it and go, I'm not willing to accept that as one of your terms. So the more definite you are, the more you risk over-defining the agreement. All right? The second thing is usually there's an amount of escalation. If an escalation addendum is used, what you're basically saying, and we just did one of these about 3 days ago, what you're basically saying is if any other offers are on the table, that we're willing to better that offer by $500, and it's usually based on the net. It's not just on sales price, because if you had two $200,000 offers and one wanted $10,000 in closing costs and one wanted $5,000, they're not equal at that point. One is making the seller $5,000 more. So what this is saying is we'll better the other offer by $500 based on the net. And then there's normally an escalation cap that as we do this, we're not willing to go over. If you're going to call my escalation, I'm okay with that as long as when you escalate me, I don't go above a specific price. So if I'm at $249.5 and I cap at $250, you can bump me once, but you can't bump me again. And now the next term is the terms of the amount, loan amount, or the sales price increase. So once people associate with, let's just say the escalation raised my offer by $2,000, well, that $2,000 has to be applied to something. Is it going to be applied to down payment? Can it be applied to loan amount? I mean, if they were at minimum down payment to start with, your figures are going to have to change at that point. And so normally there's something that is in an offer that allows you to say any escalation will be applied to, for example, it may say the loan amount and the sales price accordingly. I mean, the loan amount and the down payment accordingly, whatever the norm would be to align it. Total increase shall be applied to the loan amount, total increase shall be applied to the down payment, or the loan amount shall automatically increase by whatever the percentages of the adjusted sales price. So if you're trying to get a 95% loan to value, then you would just say it would increase to 95% of the adjusted sales price, and that would make the down payment automatically an additional 5%. Okay? So you have to adjust within this escalation how you're going to apply the increase to the offer. There's usually a term that allows for proof of a competing offer. You have to show that after you called my offer and bumped my price, I have the right to say, show me proof of the other offer. And it usually will say we're going to We're going to highlight out the person's name, etc., so that people are not having their private information shared. But there's usually some kind of an agreement to share that offer. That's usually in most of them. They also want a definition and application of net. So it says here on this escalation, in this addendum, the term net is defined as the sales price less all concessions. So when you're willing to increase over and above an offer that you're competing with, then they have to make sure that that net number is being based on the sales price less concessions, not just sales price. Now, in the handouts today, I left you an example of, this is a very involved, this particular one came from a very involved escalation addendum that included a place to calculate it so that somebody could see how did you get to that figure. So if you all have it in front of you, I'm hoping that maybe you had a chance to download the forms for the session. But if you have a form that says calculation of sales price escalation, I want to show you how this would have applied. Okay? Let me show you one more thing. In fact, let me find out what that one just shifted real quick from that. Okay. Now, one thing real quick before we go to that is there's also usually an appraisal paragraph. In other words, if you bump me by $3,000 and I agree to it, are we all going to be bound now by the appraisal? So is this going to be without regard? Am I making this new offer without regard to the appraisal, which basically means I need to make up the difference in some kind of cash if it doesn't appraise for it? Or is this going to be subject to appraisal? So yes, you bumped me by $3,000, but if it doesn't appraise for that, then all bets are off. And so usually the parties will agree to what will happen to the appraisal once we've gotten to this higher price or these terms that we've changed. All right, so now let's go back to this escalation workshop. And you've got the form. And here's what happened. The first buyer offers $250,000, and they asked for $5,000 in closing cost. They agreed to escalate $1,000 in increments above the highest net. So they're willing to go up by $1,000, and their maximum escalation was $5,000. Now keep in mind, and I know, guys, there's no way in the world for you to take all of this in 45 minutes. You're going to have to look at this thing. You're going to have to listen to the recording. You're going to have to pull the form. You're going to have to study the content. But I want you to have an example to see how it works. Okay? So in looking at this, the second offer comes in at $255,000. So we can see immediately it's $5,000 more than the other offer. They asked for $8,000 in closing cost, and they had no escalation authorized. So they're looking and going, hey, we offered, we're offering more than the other one. Let's just say they know it for whatever reason. They offered or asked for $8,000. How is that going to compare now when the first buyer said that they would escalate? So if you want to pull out that form and put it in front of you, I want to show you how this would work out. Okay, so let's go to, here it is. Here's your first offer. The first buyer said, I'm going to offer $250,000. I want $5,000 in closing cost, right? So I want $5,000 in closing cost. That makes my net price $245,000. Let's go now to the other offer. They offered $255,000. They asked for $8,000 in closing cost. So the net to the seller now is $2,000 higher on the second offer. So when it comes to the buyer on the other side, that buyer is off by $2,000. They agreed to go up $1,000 per increment above the highest net, right? So the highest net is $247,000. So they're going to have to now make up the difference plus $1,000 over the highest net. So they're increasing by $3,000. Now, can you all remember what their maximum escalation was that they authorized? Can somebody put it into the group chat? What did they say was the maximum that they would authorize as an escalation? Anybody remember that in the figures that I gave you earlier? I know that's like a loaded question with all these figures coming at you. Let me share that with you. Let's see. Yeah, there was a price, but there was also, Pam, when we go back, let me go back, it's worth it. Let me go back and show you. Now let's look at this. $250. They asked for $5,000, right? They looked at $1,000 increments, and what was their maximum escalation? Somebody put it in. What's the maximum escalation on their part as the buyer who really, really wanted this house, right? It's a $5,000 maximum escalation. Here's our second buyer at $255 at $8,000, and they didn't authorize any kind of escalation. So now let's go back and take a look at it. Here they are. This person had to make up the difference of $2,000 and then escalate $1,000 over the competing offer. That means they went up $3,000. So are they below their maximum $5,000 escalation? Yes or no? Okay, now I'm going to wait this time and you have to give me an answer. I'll know you're out there because of it. Somebody give me an answer. Are they beneath their maximum $5,000 escalation? Come on, somebody can answer that one. Nobody is going to answer it. Come on, Mark, you were out there before. Can you give me an answer? Is that, have we exceeded our maximum escalation? Okay. Yes. Okay, here's what we've got. If they went up $2,000 in net, because they have to match the net first, and then they escalate $1,000 over the highest net, which was $247, they now have gone up $3,000. Their maximum escalation was $5. They're still below that maximum escalation. So at this point, their new price and their new offer, if the seller were calculating this, if the agent were calculating this, is they would have the right to go back to the buyer, the first buyer, and say, we're countering back your offer at $253 with $5,000 in closing cost. And that would have been a legitimate counter based on the terms of escalation. And they didn't have to go back and even address this buyer because that buyer didn't say anything about escalating. So at this point, if this buyer now says, great, I'm signing off on it, then what has happened is that buyer, because the agent knew what to do, was able to compete with an offer, and they had no idea what the terms of that offer was. They also knew that after a $5,000 increase, this first buyer didn't want it, right? They didn't want to go up any higher than that. So we were still within the $5,000. It was only $3,000, but we beat the other offer, and that first buyer won using an escalation addendum. Okay? So just know, I did this the other day. We had a buyer who saw a house. It was the only one in the market. We're in a multiple offer kind of scenario. And this individual had a condo that had to close. It was settled, but it was closed. I mean, it was sold, but it wasn't settled. They wanted it so badly because this boy grew up in that neighborhood, and they wanted that house. And we had another offer that came in right behind us. And I knew I had to worry about the settlement of a home. I knew I had the contingency on settlement. And I called the agent, and I said, listen, they want this house. It is his neighborhood. He grew up in it. They have fallen in love with this house. She's pregnant, getting ready to have her baby. They have painted themselves into this home. I know you have another offer. I am willing to put an escalation into this. And the other offer was, again, a sight unseen buyer coming from overseas. The agent was writing it for them. And they had no escalation, but they had no house to sell. And it turned out that this particular seller was a profit seller. They were a bottom line net seller. He was willing to wait and take the risk of the settlement contingency as long as we met all the criteria that we were willing to put into that escalation addendum, and we got the offer. We got the offer. Okay, so just know I was a hero with that person because they looked and said, oh my gosh, Pam, we had a house to sell, they didn't, and we still got it. Yes, they got it because we took the escalation addendum and plugged it in and beat the offer financially. Okay, let's come off of that now. Your head's probably spinning, your stomach may be hurting a little bit, but once you get the concept, once you understand it, once you internalize it, and it takes a little bit of really studying to do that, it is a phenomenal tool in a multiple offer market. Now let's talk about this concept also, because we've all seen the personal letter that comes with an offer. And my question to you would be, in first gut reaction, do you think that the letter coming from the buyer in a multiple offer can make the difference in the buyer winning the deal, winning the transaction? Would you give me a yes or a no if you had to note this in the chat? Yes or no? Okay? And here's what I'm going to share with you. The answer is it depends. It depends, and I'm going to share this with you. And thank you, Pamela. Yes, it depends, because I've seen the answer be absolutely yes, and I've seen the answer be absolutely no. Here's the deal. You have to have some read on who the seller is. And I'll give you the example of the no. I had a seller. The buyer wrote a letter because they truly had a son that was autistic. They wanted to be in an area that had a lot of space around them, so if he had just the days, they didn't want the neighbor right on top of them, and this house wasn't. And they wrote a whole letter about how important this was. And I ended up having a high D seller. And my high D seller, instead of going, oh, wow, wasn't that really special? I feel so bad for these people. I want them to have my house. The seller looked at me instead and said, don't you think that was a little over the top? Right? So that seller who is not driven by emotion, which the D and the C tend to be not driven by emotion, did not respond to that letter in the same way. So do whatever you can. If you're going to use that as a strategy, do whatever you can to figure out who the seller might be. If they happen to be in the house and you can shake their hand, that's going to give you some indication. If you can ask the agent, all of those things are going to help you make a difference. And there are a lot of those scenarios that come in by just understanding what the criteria is for high Ds, etc. One of the other things that I do want to talk about is this financial addendum. And there is one in the section for you to download. And again, what we have found is if your buyer is willing to send it, because you have to jump through hoops to meet all of these things, but if you've got a strong financial buyer and they send a financial addendum that says all of these things have been done, and you're trying to figure out a way to set yourself apart from everybody else, and your financial addendum says, we've already checked this, we've checked this, we've checked this, and they've signed off on it, or we'll provide it, we'll provide you the letter with all of these things included, then you can give yourself an edge in a competitive market, okay? And so we're gonna pretty much start to wrap up at this point, but I want to give you these thoughts. Whoops, sorry about that, I just missed it. Here's what I want you to remember. Obviously, in a multiple offer market, the seller is always, or at least usually, but pretty much always in control. Fear of loss is the greatest negotiator for a buyer. You have to understand that it's about not what will they do, it's like what will happen if you lose this home, so that you can get them to make the best offer possible to put them in a strong negotiating position. Remember, it's not about control, it's about competing. Also understand, the seller doesn't have to call for highest and best. They can like your buyers because when they walk through, they went to the same school, their parents knew each other, and they don't care. They'll take $1,000 less even if you send an escalation and accept that person just because they want to. And the seller doesn't have to respond immediately to all offers. If you've got 3 offers sitting on the table, unless your laws in your state are different, in ours and based on standards of practice, I can negotiate 2 of those offers and not even respond to the third. I can decide that the first and the second are strongest. I want to try them first. Maybe I've had a bad experience with the agent on the third one, and I don't want to do that again. And I've decided, in talking with the seller who believes in me, that we're going to go after trying to negotiate these first. Okay, so just remember that that they have to understand clearly they're not in the driver's seat. And that's going to wrap us up for multiple offers, seeing double, pricing, and multiple offer marketing strategies. So love to have you join me with one of our upcoming sessions. We've got 2 more this afternoon, and thank you all so much for spending your time with me.
Do we have any questions?
We're pretty good, Pam?
I think so.
Okay.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
This virtual conference session has now concluded. Please close the window to exit out of the session and return to the main conference site to choose the next session to attend from the Day 1 agenda page. Thank you. You may now disconnect.